Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm your host, Ed Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Now, welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like, because the purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and any issue that's related to those issues. Today I want to continue on my series called Helping the Apologists, where I'm taking on the various arguments for the existence of God and saying why they no longer convince me, and try to offer some advice to the apologists of how they could actually make these arguments more convincing, or maybe even possibly convincing in general. And today I'm taking on the idea of fulfilled prophecies from the Bible. Now, I'm not really sure if this is an argument for God, but it is often used by theists as proof that God exists because God inspired somebody to say something prophetic, the prophecy is fulfilled, so that therefore, God. The problem is, number one, by their nature, prophecy tends to be a little bit ambiguous. But let's deal with the claim. Just a Fishing Dude proposed this one as proof for why God exists. And I'm going to basically tell you why scriptural prophecy, particularly that of the Bible, this thing right here, doesn't really prove the existence of God. In fact, a lot of these prophecies are neither testable or verifiable. Well, I should qualify that. I think all prophecies are testable. Saying something is testable, okay, anything's testable. The question is, what is the criteria for the test? So if any prophecy, an Islamic prophet, a Christian prophet, a Hindu prophet, all walk into a bar, it's not the start of a joke, but if they all did that and they all leveled a prophecy that was different about an event, one predicts event A, one predicts event B, one predicts event C, okay? None of these events are general. There's very specific things, that the bartender is going to pour a bottle of scotch for all of us, or the bartender is going to, those are kind of specific enough where you're taking a little bit of the randomness out of it, okay? So what happens then at that moment, okay, is you have to have, in order to have a testable prophecy, you have to have a prophecy that's given before the event in question, okay? There have to be witnesses to that prophecy that can be verified, okay? You then have very specific elements that prophesy so that when the fulfillment comes, it can't be any other event in history. It has to be that event is fulfilled by that prophecy, okay? You can't have ambiguity, you can't have generalities, this can't be a fortune cookie, this can't be a horoscope that says X, you're going to have prosperity in the future. And so you have to have something that can specifically nail this equals that, okay? Otherwise it's just post hoc rationalization. You're just saying, well, this is the fulfillment of this. So you're just looking at an event and saying, well, that fits what this says, so this is the fulfillment. Well, that's post hoc rationalization. It may not necessarily be so. You have to prove that this prophecy caused the prediction, okay, in some way, that you're predicting that God is going to do A, okay, well, then you have to show that God did A, okay, to prove that the prophecy is true. If it's too general, it doesn't qualify, because if it can be multiple fulfillments to a prophecy, then it becomes more and more general the more things it can fulfill it. The more specific the prophecy, the more testable it is, okay? And so generalities just don't work. The other problem is, of course, verification. Now, this is where a lot of biblical prophecies just straight up lose. Okay, first of all, you have to prove and verify the date and person of the prophet, okay, that you have to verify that this person did indeed give this prophecy, and that you can give me the date in question, or at least a general date that is in some way before the event, okay? Because if you don't have that verification of the prophet and what date they said it, then it could be written after the fact. It can be, somebody tampering with the text later and just fixing it, or just writing it out whole cloth after the fact, and saying, oh no, this was a prophet back then that prophesied this, even though the ink isn't even dry on the page of them writing down the prophecy, okay? You also have to, for verification, actually show how the event in question actually fulfills the prophecy. And there can be really no doubt and no ability to be subject to interpretation. Now, I have a high criteria, but I'm not the highest criteria that I've ever heard for prophecy. The biblical criteria for prophecy is if a prophet speaks, but things come to pass, but that prophet advocates for people disobeying the commandments of God, he's to be considered a false prophet and stoned to death. If a prophet predicts anything and it doesn't come to pass, then also a false prophet and also stoned to death. So the biblical criteria for prophecy is actually pretty high. I'm just using a more rational criteria for prophecy, which says, show me that the person in question actually prophesied these things and that you can show that the prophecy actually fits the fulfillment and there can really be no other fulfillment to that prophecy. Okay, that's our testability. That's our verification. Just a Fishing Dude gave me two basic examples, okay, of how Israel was scattered as a nation. There's various prophecies about how they're going to come back together as a nation. God is going to gather them back together, that they're going to be reformed into a nation in one day. That's often cited as, when Israel became a nation, in 1948. Well, that's a fulfillment of that prophecy. The real problem with all those prophecies, like scattered and then brought back together, that is very general. Anybody who's studied history, okay, knows that nations often get conquered, scattered, and then later on they get to return to their land. This actually happens a lot in history. People return to ancestral homelands, or they go back to places they were. They get conquered by a certain group of people, but then they rise up and become the conquerors and take over their land again. That's fairly common in history. It's not really ground shaking, especially at the time that these prophecies are given, which I'm going to talk about in a minute because we can't verify that either. But it's not really a super claim. And the fact that a nation is founded in a single day, that's not a super duper claim either. You could argue that nearly every nation has been founded in a single day when they established the government that runs them. Okay, the United States founded July 4th, 1776. Okay, this happens all the time. Okay, days that become the beginning of nations happen all the time. The Israelites and the Jews in general have had this, dialogue of this is their land, it belongs to them. And the reason why that dialogue was created is because at the time, we do have evidence of the Israelites being in Israel at various times, but not as far back as the Bible claims they do. But at the time, they were in exile in Persia. The Assyrians had basically a policy of conquer and scatter. Okay, take the people that you conquer and scatter them all through the empire. The Babylonians were a little bit more, okay, we'll let you return to your land. As long as you pay us taxes, we're good. The Persians were actually more, we're going to really help you reestablish your land. And the Persians kings, particularly Xerxes, were very much about, reestablishing people in their original ancestral homelands. But you couldn't just do that, okay? You had to have a criteria. Did you have a law? Do you have a myth of your beginning? What claim do you have to this land, okay, that I'm going to give it to you, okay? And they had to jump through all these hoops to prove this. Isn't it interesting that all of a sudden, everything in the Bible makes a little bit more sense? Because you have the Old Testament law and an origin story that's written of the Jewish people. Here's the problem with the Torah. Even the most conservative scholars that are Jewish, that are trying to figure out what hell happened to Moses and where Sinai is, are now concluded that the figure of Moses is as legendary as Hercules. Okay, it's like they cannot prove any historicity of it. There is absolutely no evidence of a group of people wandering for 40 years in the wilderness. None whatsoever. Especially a group as large as the Bible claims, they would have left some tracks archaeologically speaking, and there isn't anything. So you have this Old Testament Torah that's being written to provide law to the Persian Empire. You have the history written after the fact, okay, during the Persian Empire. I mean, we know for a fact that Jews started to gather their temple, they started to gather their scriptures. Ezra, Nehemiah, and all those guys were probably real historical figures. They were gathering all this stuff together, okay, in order to prove to the Persians that they deserved to reclaim their land, okay, and take their land back, okay. That's it, okay. And so they were compiling all this stuff and editing all this stuff. I mean, I'm sorry, the Torah is clearly edited, okay. You had 4 different things that people put together, and that's why it's so contradictory at times. You then have this history that the farther back it goes, the more fictional it gets, okay, because you get back to the time of the judges, which really have a hard time verifying any of the figures in the judges. David still only has one inscription to his existence, and it may not be him. There is some testimony to Solomon's reign, but not Saul. Okay, and then you have the divided kingdom, which there is some good historical testament to that, but a lot of the whole, miracle stuff, well, that's subject to interpretation. So we get to the prophets. Well, the prophets are being gathered and possibly written at this time of Ezra. Now, here's our problem with the Old Testament text and why it doesn't verify any prophecy, why no prophecy of Old Testament can be verified. Because the oldest texts we have are 1st century AD or 1st century BC, somewhere in there. Okay, the Dead Sea Scrolls are it. Okay, don't get me wrong, it's a great archaeological find, wonderful stuff, but that time period, at 0, we'll just say 0 AD or 1 AD, just for the sake of argument, is still 500 and some years from the time of the return to the land, and you got another 900 years. That's 900 years of stuff creeping in, of stuff changing. Now, a lot of people say, well, the text from 1 AD to 1000 AD really hasn't changed that much. No, it hasn't. But that just proves you have a really good textual tradition of preserving things. At some point, you're going to get back to where things have variance. It will happen. Okay, so you don't have any verification that any prophet actually said any of that stuff. And because there was a motivation among the people living under Persian rule to provide the Persian king Xerxes and others proof of their claim to the land, proof of all this stuff, of course they wrote this stuff to make that proof, to make that claim. Okay, and you don't think they didn't edit that? You don't think that they didn't come up with stories? I'm sorry, at this point, because we know the history of that part pretty well, and we know when they actually compiled this stuff, and we know how much of a gap we have, you can't verify any prophet actually said anything of the sort. You're taking it completely on something you can't prove. You cannot verify that in Deuteronomy Moses said this, because number one, it's pretty clear that most people now believe that Moses is mythological as Hercules or Perseus, some sort of hero that the Jewish people had, but not real and can't be verified in history or archaeology. Sure as shooting, the Egyptians would have written about the Exodus, but there's nothing, absolutely nothing. And that time frame is well documented as to what really went on there, and nothing matches up. Okay, so what you have is a bunch of Israelites trying to convince a Persian king that they belong in a certain land. And now with my political science degree, I now really understand this a whole lot better. And so they create this Old Testament scripture to present to the king saying, we have law, we have an origin story, we have history, we have our prophets, we have our religion, we have our culture, all preserved here. Let us return. And a good chunk of it's just made up, including the prophecies, because we have no verification that the prophet Joel said what he said about scattering and returning. We have no proof that Deuteronomy said they would scatter and return. It is literally possible that they wrote it after the fact to kind of bolster their claim. We have no contemporary verification for any prophet of the Old Testament whatsoever. None. You have to have somebody that lived at the same time as the prophet who doesn't have an axe to grind that says that he says it. You don't have that. with any Old Testament prophecy whatsoever. The claims are mundane, so what? A nation got scattered and then returned to land. That was happening all over the Persian Empire with all kinds of people groups. That was not spectacular. It's not unusual. It was normal, and it's still normal. Hindu, I think one of my commenters mentioned that the Hindus have that, where people predicted that certain Hindu groups would be scattered and then they returned to their land. That's not spectacular, okay? It's like people movement, geographic people movement is very predictable, okay? This is not unusual, okay? It's not a great claim. It's a mundane claim, okay? And the fact that a nation would be established in one day, that's a mundane claim. Nations are often established in one day. That's not saying anything, okay? That's like saying the sun's going to get up tomorrow, okay? That's not a prophecy. That's a prediction based on just observable fact, okay? All right, now the other one was a New Testament scripture that I was given, and I want to take that one on too, because in case you think the New Testament is better, it's not. The example was Jesus predicting his death, and in particular John 3:14 through 18. You know, the whole idea of if I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto myself, okay, and predicting the cross in a conversation with Nicodemus. Here's the problem with this prophecy. Even if I take the conservative estimate for the date of the writing of John, which is 90 AD roughly, it's more likely written in 120 or 130, well after John the Apostle would have died, and it's after the fact. The fact is, this conversation is written after the facts of Jesus' supposed crucifixion and resurrection. It can literally have been made up, because here's the other problem with it. As with many other things in the supposed four witnesses of the four Gospels, you really don't have four witnesses. You only have one. Only the Gospel writer of John talks about this event, so it doesn't even meet the biblical criteria of two or three witnesses to even have a biblical verification, let alone anything else. It almost makes you wonder why the New Testament people didn't like to deal with the Old Testament, rules and stuff, because those rules would have held them accountable to having two or three witnesses. So literally, you could have a writer dealing with the theological struggles of the first century who wasn't like a Gnostic, who opposed the Gnostics, and so he writes this gospel of Jesus, claiming to be the disciple whom Jesus loved. And what does he do? He writes a prophecy of how Jesus predicted his death and what significance it would have in order to prove his theological point. Funny that he would write it in such a way that it proves his theology, his viewpoint on who Jesus was. Interesting, huh? And I'm sorry, once again, there's no contemporary of Jesus that writes that Jesus says this, because there's no contemporary that writes about Jesus, period. There's nobody that lived at the time that Jesus was supposed to have lived that talks about Jesus, talks about his teaching, talks about his prediction. There's no verification here. You cannot verify this. Okay, you cannot verify this prophecy of Jesus. It's not verifiable. Okay, and that's the problem. This is where all biblical prophecy fails. Okay, the New Testament, Old Testament, all of it. Because there's no proper verification given for the prophecy. Fulfillment is very generalized. It's very much like a horoscope where you can say, oh, this nation is going to come back together and have prosperity. What? Just because it panned out doesn't mean that it's a predictive prophecy. It just might be common sense. Just an observed observation of history. I'm sorry, I'm not convinced by the fulfilled prophecy argument because, once again, none of these prophets can be verified. None of them have contemporaries that say that they said what they said. This is all written well after the fact. And so you can say, okay, well, here's an event. Let's write a prophecy that predicted that event. It can easily be done. Easily be done. And, that's kind of the way it is. Now, how do we fix it? Well, I think you could fix the Old Testament prophecies if you could actually get some verification that some of these prophets actually existed, and, by the way, that they prophesied at the time they said they did. You would need some sort of contemporary verifier that says, yeah, this prophet was over here doing this, and this is what he said. Well then, and if you could verify the historicity of that guy, then you'd have verification of the prophet, but you don't have that. As far as the New Testament, and particularly the Jesus one in Matthew or in John 3, it would be nice if we actually had a list of the Sanhedrin members from this time that included Nicodemus. Who was this Nicodemus? We honestly don't really know. And so that cuts him out too. If there was some way to verify that indeed Nicodemus exists, and we found Nicodemus's journal that says, yeah, I had a talk with Jesus today and this is what he said, that would be verification. As it stands, though, there is no verification that Jesus even said this. Given the nature of the Gospels, how as each one gets told, the tall tale gets whopper and bigger and bigger and bigger, and becomes more unbelievable, becomes more of a tall tale. We've reached the point of John where Jesus is Superman. Of course, they're going to write a story about him meeting some Sanhedrin member and proving some sort of theological point. You know, I'm not trying to be rude, but those that think that biblical prophecy proves God are gullible. I'm sorry, you're just gullible, okay? Because you're basically grasping at any straw that proves your point. But you may have something that's testable, but you don't have any verification for any of it, that it even passes the test. And that's what you need. If you want to fix this, you got to start getting some other sources, contemporary sources to the prophets, that says that they did indeed exist and that they said what they said. Until you have that, all of this is post after the fact. And any rationalization you have about prophecy is all post hoc. It's all post hoc rationalization after the fact. And that's what you have. And you got to get rid of that in order to fix it. Well, that's my down. Personally, I never bought this one after a while. I did kind of when I was a young fundamentalist, but the more I studied biblical prophecy, the more I became problematic for me. One, there's a bunch of prophecies that are unfulfilled that turned out to be wrong. And then once I realized that most of the Old Testament was written possibly at the time of, when the people were coming back together, and then you look at the contents of the Old Testament, you say, holy crap, they're trying to convince somebody that this land is theirs. And so they definitely had a motivation to write whatever they needed to write in order to get the land back. Sorry, to me, there's definitely some politics and some con game going here. And that's when I rejected that. And Jesus' prophecies of his death, again, to realize every gospel writer writes about that after the fact. There's no contemporary during Jesus' life that says, yeah, Jesus predicted that he would someday die and rise from the dead. He's still alive. I don't know what he's talking about. But, this is what he said. Nobody says that. It doesn't exist. You have no verification. Okay, you're sitting there saying that the many testable, verifiable prophecies. Testable, yes. Verified, not even flipping close. I'm sorry, they're not even close. If you took any of these into a courtroom and said, these are verified prophecies, any good lawyer could tear this apart and rip it to shreds and say, no, those aren't verifiable. This is the criteria for verification, and none of these meet that. Okay, bye. Go find something else to do. Quit bothering us. And that's exactly what would happen. I'm not trying to be rude, but no, this doesn't work for me. Never had. After I realized the prophecies were too general, they could fit so many different events, and a lot of it is just written after the fact. It just doesn't work for me anymore. Well, thanks for stopping by. I hope you've enjoyed part 3 here of me taking on the arguments for the existence of God. I think the next one will be the transcendental one somebody mentioned. But you're welcome to give me another suggestion for an argument for the existence of God I will take on, and the one that gets the most vote I'll take on in a couple weeks. So keep leaving those comments in the comments section to let me know what you want to have. Thank you once again for stopping by. Like the video, share the video, comment below. Subscribe to the channel. We are so close to 1,000 subscribers, which is a big deal for me. We're like 52 away. If you're watching this, just subscribe. Thank you very much for doing that. Make sure you share the video. I appreciate it. I'm sitting here wishing you a good day. Live your best life. Do everything you can to make your life a happy one, because you only get one go around and you need to make it a good one. I want to thank you once again for stopping by. I'm going to wish you a good day, and I'll see you next time.